I want to look at today, though, and my main focus really is on the interaction of poetry and music in the 19th century German art song. And I'll just back up a little bit and say what an art song even is in the first place, because it is so not a self explanatory term at all. For my purposes, is the construction outside so loud that it's causing a problem? I can close my window right now if that's...
It's all right. I hear a little, but I think we can still hear you.
Okay, speaking of soundscapes mediating political conditions, they're like building a luxury condo out there. It's terrible. Anyway, an art song, for present purposes, is a poem written by one person, set to music by another person. So they're not, Simon and Garfunkel sitting down and writing a song together. They may not know each other. This is the Romantic period, so there's no copyright, there's no protections or anything like that. And that is actually part of what interests me so much about this whole business, because it means this is the art of a composer getting their hands on someone else's work, a freestanding bit of work, and doing their thing to it. And when they do their thing to it, the result is a song, an art song. Art song in the, it's the short song form of the Western classical music tradition. It's usually one singer and one piano, although there are certainly exceptions. It's distinct from opera because opera is a staged drama. These things are unstaged. You could think of them as monologues. It's the singer's job to create a persona every time for every song, and it's really a interpretive challenge for the singer. But what really I want to talk about, what interests me really the most, is the way that these songs result from the literary interpretive act of the composer. So this song form, I'm specifically looking at its romantic rediscovery circa Schubert, and we're talking 1816 is frequently considered the quote-unquote birth song of the German Lied. Lied, simply German for song. There have been songs since time immemorial, so it is not the case that this is a new thing. Part of what is so interesting to me is that a very old thing got a very new take on life at that moment in the Romantic period. And so, since we're talking a little bit about the social and political implications of these things, I'm going to try to focus in a little bit on what I see as the political meaning of what happened with the art song in Schubert's time. So we can trace art song, like I said, very far back. But in the 18th century, usually the standards for what songs should be was not so much art song, but folk song. There was a massive craze in the 18th century for the recording and documentation of folk song, folk poetry. You have Des Knaben Wunderhorn with Achim von Arnim and Clemens Brentano, who went around supposedly collecting songs right from the mouths of the rustic, the populist Das Volk, which is a kind of spurious, sort of classist notion, but it was highly romanticized, and Goethe was a major figure in that craze. Goethe is a poet who paradoxically wanted very much for his poems to be set to music, but not in the way that Schubert eventually starts doing it, where the composer is doing a full-fledged literary reading as the basis of their creative compositional act. Goethe wanted, for most of his life anyway, for the composer to take very much a back seat to what the poet has done, because he saw his poems, him being Goethe, as these rather perfect, self-completed things, and not without reason. In any case, though, he had a couple of right-hand, court composers who weren't necessarily bad songwriters and weren't necessarily all musically conservative. But what he valued about them is that they would set his poems to music without doing too much, without adding too much, without, in Goethe's interesting word, him having to see what the composer thought of his poem. So there's this notion of transparency, which itself is kind of fascinatingly inarticulable and almost a bit illogical. So that is where we're coming in from the 18th century. Then you get to Schubert's time, and things begin to change. It's not that Schubert had some contempt for folkish style or anything like that, and yet what he starts doing with poems is much more radical, much more, it does a lot more, well, frankly, violence to the poetic line. Not that the violence is the point. In fact, what many of his poet friends praise him for is for knowing their meaning better than they knew it themselves, for restoring to the poem some lost expressive potential. But what that really entails is his song compositions are difficult in a way that songwriting just wasn't prior to him. So he's really kind of raised the standard from, songs are things you sing in the drawing room for amusement and they're very accessible, to suddenly he's professionalized this thing. And where politics comes in is, well, why did he do that? Why did that happen? Did that have to happen? And to a certain degree, I'm going to say, yeah, that kind of had to happen. And it's not, like I said, because he's, anti, populist or anything like that. Rather, it's, well, for one thing, it's totally in keeping with the romantic interest in the mixing of genres. Friedrich Schlegel has some very famous remarks on that. Very, it fits right in with a lot of romantic aesthetic ideas that were going on at the time. But what I'll focus on here is the way that I think it may have been a reflection of the political circumstances that Schubert and his friends lived in. Two things about that. Schubert and his friends, the Schubert circle, so-called, is a huge, huge part of Schubert reception. He had a very tight-knit circle of friends. They were very, very close, and he really was sort of writing for his people, not so much for a hypothetical broad audience, although there was, he did have some public moments and all of that. There's no other composer really, we don't talk about the Mozart circle, the Beethoven circle. This is a special kind of environment, and it factors in a lot of Schubert criticism and reception. So the other thing then is where and when they lived. They lived in Vienna. They lived during and after the Napoleonic Wars. They lived in the police state overseen by the brutal Prince Clemens von Metternich, who ruled with an iron hand, and citizens simply were not safe in those conditions. If you said anything bad about the government, you could be exiled from Vienna. This, unfortunately, in fact, happened to one of Schubert's poet friends, Johann Senn, who, well, one unfortunate night, Schubert, Senn, and a couple of others were talking smack about the government at a tavern. There was a plainclothes agent who overheard them, tried to, join the conversation, and was rebuffed. Schubert and his friends were arrested. Schubert spent a night in prison and now had a police record, which is absolutely not what you want when you live in this climate. And his even more unfortunate friend Senn was permanently exiled from Vienna with no recourse and never came back, was never able to see his home again. This really put a damper on some of the joyous expression of the Schubert circle and these young people. Also, there was a lot of physical danger. There was a lot of illness. There was a lot of, terrible public health hazards. It was a really difficult time to be alive. And here I'm drawing a lot on an essay by Leon Botstein called Schubert's Vienna in here, which is very illuminating about these conditions. A lot of Schubert's friends were forced to seek work as censors for the government or other desk jobs, and it was a harrowing thing for these young folks who are, younger than I am now. They're poets, they're playwrights, they're artists, and their job is to squelch one another's expressive freedom. One of Schubert's close friends, this is, of course, not the sole reason, but took his own life jumping from his office window after many years as a government censor. A playwright named Eduard von Bauernfeld, who also translated Shakespeare and other things like that, recorded he was going to start a desk job the next day and said he felt like he was about to go be hanged. And I think it was a testimony from him relating that or maybe this is Botstein's words, that the will to survive in this Vienna was accompanied by this self-hatred, this loathing for what one had to do to survive. And that may be relatable, in fact, for some of us in the struggle to find work that doesn't do harm to other people in the present conditions, even if it's not quite so obvious of a vice-like environment that you're living in. In any case, part of what I want to contend, and I'll wrap up here depending on how I'm doing with time, is, wrap up soon? Yeah, thank you, is that these conditions are part of why the art song went from being a thing that was all about transparency and folk-like simplicity into being this thing that was much more difficult, much more hermeneutically, interpretively intensive and challenging, much harder to play, much harder to sing, and much more demanding on the listener. And it wasn't, I think, for the sake of being secretive or elitist or anything of the kind, but rather because these folks' ability to express themselves safely absolutely depended on making that transition. Wish I could play a little sample of Art Song, because many of us understandably don't know what it sounds like. It's kind of a margin within the margin of Western classical music, and that's part of why I love it so dearly. I will stop there. Thank you so much, everyone. I really, really have appreciated sharing this.